Good morning, people. It's been a while since we had a bit of a dialogue. Been a busy winter for me, an interesting winter for sure. Um, some things to update, some things to think about as we move into a new year here, and I thought we'd talk about it a bit. So, as I sit here in Vancouver, all's pretty well and comfortable. Very unprecedentedly early and warm spring for us. I was out working on the boat yesterday, cleaning up the bright work a little bit, getting ready for a season. But our early plants like the skunk cabbage and other things are already up here in the second week of February. There's practically nothing for snowpack, and we are looking at drought and water shortage issues um, already. That doesn't mean that we didn't have a couple of days of cold. I mean, we did have some of that Arctic instability come down and freeze us good and hard a couple of weeks ago. But pretty well all winter long, we've been running 5 to 10 degrees centigrade above historic baseline here locally, setting records nearly daily. And the records that we were setting were ones that we set last year. So if you look at, and I will post a image of for you, the data from the buoy reports across all latitudes 60 north and 2. The oceans are warming at a rate that's truly terrifying, like approaching a degree centigrade per year. That's a rate of change that obviously isn't sustainable, or things would boil in a human lifetime. But that's where we're at right now. Things are changing at a rate that are unimaginable even for those of us who were pessimistic about what the future would hold for us. This is laying against a backdrop, of course, of geopolitics and domestic politics. I mean, here obviously I'm in North America, so I pay more attention to that. But of course, we have wars and rumors of wars and outright genocide that's occurring completely in plain view. The savagery of what's occurring in Gaza is unprecedented in the modern era, as well as the, I must say, lack of moral compass and ambivalence that it seems to be present in people towards this particular issue. I mean, certainly I do meet well-fed, comfortable Westerners who, in a quiet moment, will admit to you that they are uncomfortable with what's going on in Gaza, but are afraid to speak out about it because of the consequences that they feel that they will face from certain factions. Well, it's good that Hamas is fighting for your liberation too. It's worth recognizing that the oppression that is there, visited most savagely on the Gazan people, does reach beyond that, and it reaches to impacting many of us in our own lives where we sit, regardless of where we are in the world and how liberated we think we are. We are moving into a world where there's really no pretense of there being any other kind of justice than might making right. And if you happen to be on the outside of the city walls and unprotected by empire, your prospects, regardless of where you are or where you live in the world, they look grimmer all the time. So other places where we see this phenomenon of might make right and the breakdown of the social contract and loss of anything resembling justice or rule of law, I mean, obviously, in terms of the U.S. elections, although I despise, I would say, any of the candidates that are presented to us to choose among, it does certainly bother me that you can have an individual like Donald Trump, who is a garden variety mobster for sure, and a seedy, low quality human being for sure, among many. Um, the interesting aspect of Donald Trump is that he is a scummy slimebag mobster who's outside of the inner circle of mobsters. If that makes him attractive to you, I'm not sure why, but it makes him interesting, let's say. Even an individual like Trump, with the power and resources that he has available to him to defend himself, he is still vulnerable to an endless assault of made up legal questions and legal threats and charges of this, that, and the other thing, crimes that are just ubiquitous among our political elite. Even he finds himself in a position in which the rule of law is foggy and questionable, and it becomes a matter of might make right. That he can be accused of things that are speculative, let's say, and still have to basically defend himself. And if he didn't have the means at his disposal to do so, he would have found himself in a prison cell long ago. I'm not here to justify or make any moral judgments about any of that. Again, I would say that I think they're all vile human beings. Comparing in the contrast of like Hunter Biden's shenanigans, it becomes a little more curious. That all being aside, what I'm more concerned about is how do I possibly, as a little peon like myself, stand any chance in this might makes right parody of what we call justice. There's really no way that I can even pretend that there's any possibility of my defending myself against empowered interests if someone like Donald Trump cannot. If the basic rule of law has been so co-opted and weaponized as a tool of oppression that it can be turned against anyone for purposes of coercion, where do I stand a chance if somewhere I were to run afoul of powerful interests? What chance would I have? And I can tell you that in the industry that I work in, this is becoming a new and novel problem that we face all the time. I mean, many of the individuals that I work for are quite affluent, and or especially over the last couple of years, the kinds of ways in which these affluent people make their money becomes conspicuously more dodgy. The problem that one faces in working with these individuals is they have the tendency to simply not pay you once the job is done. This is a new phenomenon that we're having a hard time figuring out how to deal with. And because the rule of law serves powerful interests first, you as a common tradesman do not have sufficient might to find remedy against these interests if they just simply choose to steal your time, effort, labor, and materials. There's really nothing you can do. Obviously, many of us feel that the the social contract between individuals, whether that's business or political, um, has become really degraded or degraded, that basic human promises and commitments mean very little. It seems difficult to even have someone able to commit to, showing up and having a cup of coffee with you on time, let alone anything deeper than that. The predatory aspect of looking for that connection, always seeking what is best in the short time, in terms of selfish interest, comes first. And those who do that and do that well become rewarded with power, and that becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop where you have more power and the ability to exploit more. And you will find yourself, if you are quote unquote fortunate, to rise to prominence by being a fantastic cheat. For those of us who can't stomach that kind of interaction, this presents a real crisis. Now, some would obviously ask, especially those who haven't thought about the consequences of it very much, that as we move into this rather Mad Max kind of world of might makes right, of those in empire and those on the outside, well, why would one not choose then to flourish within empire, right? Why not join the mighty? Well, it isn't so much a matter of power, but how power is used, obviously. And if you use whatever power you might have for the purpose of exploitation rather than creation, you are obviously an individual who exploits rather than creates. And there are consequences in the real world in terms of the quality of your relationship that you have with other people, reality, and yourself. And as far as I am concerned, and as I have come to learn, there is no amount of power that comes from exploitation that is worth giving up a quality, honest, authentic relationship with self that is loving and life affirming. That's why you don't do it. Still, that begs the question, if you are going to choose against being a destroyer and an exploiter, how is it that you use the tools that you are in possession of to counter as much as possible and to evade, certainly distance oneself from being a participant in the suicide pact we call civilization? How do you do that? How do you avoid embroiling yourself in this mess? Well, that becomes a practical concern, one that we've talked about a great deal on this particular channel. But certainly at this moment and as we go forward, it's clear that the urgency to do so is more pressing and more obvious even daily. Some of us live in pockets of stability and relative affluence, yet where the pressures of exploitation are more distal. If that's the case, you're fortunate. Do not mistake that privilege for stability and safety. Grasp that opportunity as a chance, and perhaps a last chance, to prepare yourself for the inevitable. As civilization collapses, The number of people that can be supported within the safe inner walls of empire are less by the day. And there will come a point in time in which you will face a 2,000-pound bomb if you and your family and your lifestyle is inconvenient to the maintenance of empire. Be sure that you have found yourself options and other places to be before you find yourself there. But to be sure, for many of us in the inside the protective walls of empire in the Western world, that which most effectively captures us is convenience. And that while we may be well aware of the increasing encroachment of oppressive influences, we tolerate them because to resist them would be far more uncomfortable. Unfortunately, one who utilizes that strategy will find themselves, once the oppressive forces have become unbearable, no longer in possession of the means or the autonomy to make any choices in their life to resist or do otherwise. It takes individuals who are forward thinking and can recognize the inevitability and the necessity of the collapse and the self-cannibalism of the mega machine, knowing that it will simply consume itself as we run out of resource, knowing that we who sit at the lower end of power and influence and status will be next in line to be tossed into the furnaces, knowing that those who are forward and thinking enough to recognize the inevitable will be the only ones that act. And the window for constructive action is drawing near a close. So what then does action look like? Well, first person, real and concrete, for sure, not abstract, not mere indulgence in ideology. It's not the abstract and the ideological that is oppressing you. The tools that are being used to oppress you are technological, financial, and very, very real. To resist those, your actions will be, by necessity, equally as real as tangible. For individuals around the world who have found themselves in circumstances of this type throughout history and facing overwhelming odds, the strategies have always looked the same. First, present as little target as possible. You are far less likely to draw the ire of the resources that empire has at its disposal to threaten and control if you simply maintain a very low profile and present very little target. Secondly, it's essential that one's very activities are not at cross purposes with one's survival. There's no point in participating within a system, contributing value and resource to a system that the system will then turn upon you to oppress and control you. Most of us are making that mistake now. We all know this. This is simple and straightforward. It's just that the tools that empire have at their disposal at this moment are much larger in scope, much more omnipresent, and much more sophisticated than they've ever been. And the sophistication of our response needs to be equally as thoughtful, let's just say. But as the sailor here, now let me offer this observation, at least for myself. I have always found it more difficult and more excruciating to be sitting in the anchorage, watching the barometer, waiting for the first puff of wind in anticipation of the storm. The nervousness and anxiety of waiting for the inevitable has always been more difficult for me to emotionally bear, at least, than the storm itself. There's nothing you can much do in the waiting, but when the event finally occurs, there is at least the solace of action, which has been said, of course, action being the antidote to despair. Time for action is here. Certainly over the last couple of years we've discussed many ways of thinking about how to formulate strategies for right action. Some of that is worth revisiting now. Some of it's worth refining. Maybe we'll do that over the forthcoming season. I intend to be out and about quite a little bit and tooling up my game, and let's just report from here. Thus far it's been coming along really nicely. Hope all this finds you well, people. Be strong.